20%. That is the number Washington should be terrified of. 20% of all U.S. electricity comes from nuclear power. And now that entire pillar of America's energy system is standing on a fault line of its own making. Because in one reckless escalation of an economic war, the United States has just provoked its single most critical supplier to walk away. Canada, the largest uranium supplier to the U.S., has officially suspended long-term nuclear fuel contracts. Not because of war, not because of shortages, but because of policy arrogance. Because Donald Trump threatened a 35% tariff on Canadian minerals and accused Ottawa of so-called energy extortion. This was supposed to be pressure. Instead, it backfired. Within 6 months, nuclear reactors in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York could be forced offline. Not hypothetically, logistically, physically. No fuel, no fission. No fission, no power. And this is the real crisis. America did not lose uranium because Canada ran out. America lost uranium because it chose confrontation over interdependence. So the question is no longer whether Trump's aggression was reckless. The question is far more dangerous. Why did the United States willingly shoot itself in the foot and call it strength? To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to strip away the rhetoric and look at the mechanics. Energy systems do not run on slogans. They run on physics, contracts, and supply chains that take decades to build and minutes to break. Canada is not just a uranium supplier to the United States, it is the supplier. In recent years, Canada has provided the largest share of uranium used by U.S. nuclear reactors, feeding a system that generates roughly 20% of total American electricity. That is not a marginal input. That is base load power, the kind that runs hospitals, data centers, subways, and financial markets without interruption. Nuclear fuel is not interchangeable. You cannot replace Canadian uranium overnight with a phone call to another country. The fuel assemblies are reactor-specific. Licensing takes years. Regulatory approvals are slow by design. And inventories are lean because the industry operates under just-in-time logic to control costs. This is where Washington's miscalculation becomes lethal. U.S. utilities do not stockpile years of uranium. They rely on long-term contracts, predictable delivery schedules, and stable diplomatic relationships. When those contracts are suspended, there is no short-term workaround. Marginal costs explode, spot market prices spike, and utilities are forced into a bidding war they cannot win. The economic logic is unforgiving. As fuel costs rise, electricity prices rise, not linearly, but exponentially. Nuclear plants are capital-intensive, low-margin operations. Even small disruptions push them into negative economics. When that happens, operators shut reactors down rather than run at a loss. And here is the structural vulnerability. The states most exposed are not peripheral. Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York sit at the core of the U.S. industrial and financial system. These reactors are not backup capacity, they are load-bearing. This is not theory, it is arithmetic. Trump framed tariffs as leverage, but in supply chains like nuclear fuel, leverage cuts both ways. When one side controls the choke point, threats do not intimidate, they destabilize. And once instability enters an energy system, it does not ask for permission before cascading. That is the economic reality Washington ignored. This is where the narrative collapses, not in Ottawa, not in boardrooms abroad, but inside the United States itself. Trump's tariff threat was framed as an act of dominance. In reality, it detonated inside America's own energy economy. Start with Illinois. It is the largest nuclear-producing state in the country. More than half of its electricity comes from nuclear reactors. Those reactors were designed, licensed, and fueled under long-term assumptions of Canadian uranium reliability. When supply contracts are frozen, operators do not have patriotic alternatives. They have deadlines, and those deadlines are measured in months, not election cycles. Pennsylvania follows the same pattern. Nuclear power anchors its grid stability, especially during winter peaks and summer heat waves. Without guaranteed fuel delivery, utilities face an impossible choice: run reactors into unprofitable territory or begin controlled shutdowns to avoid catastrophic losses. New York is even more exposed. Nuclear power underpins not just residential demand, but the financial and digital infrastructure of the Northeast Corridor. Data centers, trading floors, transportation networks. A single prolonged outage ripples outward, turning energy scarcity into economic paralysis. Industry groups have already begun sounding alarms. Utility associations warn that fuel disruptions could force unplanned capacity retirements. Grid operators quietly acknowledge that replacement power would come almost entirely from natural gas, at far higher prices and far higher volatility. That is where the real betrayal lands, on American consumers. Electricity prices are projected to surge as much as 300% in affected regions if nuclear capacity goes offline, not because of speculation, because when baseload power disappears, the grid scrambles for the most expensive marginal units available. Households pay more, small businesses absorb losses, manufacturing margins evaporate. And this is happening at the worst possible time. Inflation remains sticky. Interest rates are elevated. Data centers are expanding rapidly. Electric vehicles are adding load to grids already stretched thin. The system had no slack, and Washington chose to test it anyway. What makes this backfire so severe is its asymmetry. Canada does not lose electricity. Canada does not face blackouts. Canada does not scramble for fuel. It simply redirects uranium to buyers who are expanding nuclear capacity aggressively and offering long-term certainty. The United States, meanwhile, absorbs the shock internally. Trump called this strategy strength, but strength does not raise bill powers. Strength does not threaten grid collapse. Strength does not force governors, utilities, and regulators into emergency planning. This was not pressure applied outward. This was damage absorbed inward. While Washington escalated publicly, Ottawa moved quietly and decisively. Canada did not issue ultimatums. It did not posture. It executed a reallocation strategy years in the making. The suspension of long-term uranium contracts with U.S. utilities was not an emotional response. It was a structural pivot. Mark Carney's message was blunt. Canada will not fuel an economy attempting to economically strangle us. That was not rhetoric for domestic applause. It was a signal to global markets that Canadian resources would now flow toward predictable partners, not volatile ones. And the alternatives were already in place. France is accelerating nuclear investment as part of its energy sovereignty doctrine. China is expanding nuclear capacity at historic speed to stabilize its grid and decarbonize heavy industry. Both countries offer something Washington no longer does: long-term certainty, fixed contracts, non-hostile trade policy, strategic alignment. Canada redirected uranium shipments accordingly. But the counter-strategy goes deeper than exports. Canada has spent the last decade reinforcing logistics that bypass American choke points. Rail capacity linking Saskatchewan's uranium production to Atlantic ports has been expanded. Port infrastructure optimized for transatlantic shipment has been upgraded. Regulatory coordination with European partners has been streamlined to reduce friction. At the same time, Canada has tightened integration with Mexico and the European Union across critical minerals, energy components, and grid technology. These are not symbolic alliances. They are supply chain architectures designed to survive U.S. unpredictability.
This is the uncomfortable truth Washington refuses to confront. Canada no longer needs the United States as a default customer. Diversification has reduced dependency. Alternative buyers have absorbed volume. Pricing power has shifted. And once those pathways are operational, they do not disappear when tempers cool. From Canada's perspective, this is not retaliation, it is risk management. U.S. policy volatility has turned American demand into a liability. Tariff threats, accusations of energy extortion, and unilateral escalation signal to suppliers that contracts may be politicized overnight. No serious energy exporter builds a future on that foundation. So, Canada adjusted. The irony is devastating. In trying to assert dominance, Washington accelerated its own irrelevance within the very supply chains it once anchored. Canada did not isolate itself, it internationalized. And the message embedded in this counter-strategy is unmistakable. Energy security belongs to those who build trust, not those who weaponize trade. This is where the damage becomes permanent.
Energy trade is not just about molecules and megawatts. It is about trust. And trust, once broken, does not reset with a new administration or a different tone at a press conference. For decades, the United States benefited from an unspoken assumption that it was a stable anchor customer. Contracts would be honored, disputes would be resolved quietly, supply chains would be insulated from political theater. That assumption is now gone. From the perspective of Canada and every other resource supplier watching, the lesson is clear. If uranium can be threatened with tariffs today, it can be politicized again tomorrow. The rational response is not to wait and hope. It is to redesign exposure out of the system entirely. This is the geopolitical shift Washington underestimated. Even if Trump leaves office, the risk premium remains. Utilities, exporters, and governments do not plan on election cycles, they plan on decades. Once supply routes are redirected, infrastructure is rebuilt, and contracts are signed elsewhere, there is no incentive to reverse course. And the consequences extend beyond North America. France and China are not passive beneficiaries. They gain secure access to high-quality uranium. They strengthen their nuclear fleets. They lock in long-term pricing stability. Meanwhile, the U.S. grid grows more fragile, more expensive, and more politically constrained. Russia and China also benefit strategically. Every fracture in Western energy coordination weakens collective leverage. Every blackout risk erodes U.S. credibility when it lectures others on energy security and climate leadership. Influence does not disappear overnight. It leaks out, contract by contract. The most dangerous aspect of this shift is psychological. Once allies internalize the idea that the United States is unpredictable, they stop building systems around it. They stop treating it as indispensable. They begin planning for a future where American participation is optional. That is how power erodes, not through defeat, but through disengagement. Washington believed tariffs were a show of force. History will record them as the moment America taught its closest partners to plan without it. Power is often misunderstood. It is not the ability to threaten, it is the ability to be relied upon. In this crisis, the United States chose intimidation over cooperation, aggression over stability. And the result was not compliance, it was collapse. Contracts were suspended, supply chains rerouted, trust withdrawn. Canada did not fire a shot, it simply stopped fueling a system that no longer respected reciprocity. The warning here extends far beyond uranium. In a world of interdependent infrastructure, economic war is not a zero-sum game. When you weaponize trade, you invite others to redesign their futures without you in them. So here's the question that will define the next decade of geopolitics.
When allies stop seeing the United States as a partner and start treating it as a risk, can American power survive on pressure alone? Leave your answer in the comments. The debate is just beginning.